Kevin Esterling is a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside. His research focuses on institutional design for communication in democratic politics, experimental design, and science ethics and validity. Professor Esterling, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I know this is a really interesting topic, and this is your bread and butter as a professor. So I want to jump straight into the first question/topic. For our audience, can you first please briefly describe what digital democracy is and why it's significant for us today?
So digital democracy, both of those words have lots of different meanings, and so a lot of times what I try to do is to kind of narrow them down to make it so that it's something more manageable. And so for the digital part, I think people who work in the field of digital democracy are mostly thinking about kind of online web-based communication technology, so websites, social media apps, and that sort of thing. And then democracy also can mean a lot of different things, but one thing that's kind of a core thing of modern democracy is that we want in a democracy for our government to be responsive to constituents' concerns, and so that should be responsive and kind of represent our interests. But we also want our government to be accountable, and so what a lot of times we think about those two is that online communication technology can enhance both of those things. So it makes it easier to hold the government accountable when you have kind of ready access to information about what your legislators are doing and how they're voting and what actions they took in committees and that kind of thing, or what bureaucrats are up to and that kind of thing. So having more ready access to information through the web helps to make the government more accountable. But then also the other aspect of communication technology is it enables us to have kind of a many-to-many communication that just wasn't possible in the past before the kind of current state of the internet. And so nowadays, I could post something in a social media app or post a video, and it could end up being seen by millions of people. And that was something that really wasn't possible in the early days. And so that kind of, it has the potential to empower ordinary people to be able to speak more effectively to their government because they have a microphone and a voice to speak. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that one of the interesting parts about it is that point on accountability. Right. So I guess off of that point, would you say that digital democracy and everything you've described, what it is and its purpose, was there something before that people use to hold our elected officials accountable, or is this a newer idea that we've kind of delved into in the recent years?
So you could think of again that technology can make government more transparent and more responsive, or at least that's what we hope that it does. And so in terms of making it government more transparent, technology hasn't really revolutionized that sort of how we're able to hold government accountable, because pretty much all the information that we needed, even back in the olden days when I was young, we could still figure out how our members of Congress voted and what they did in committee. It was just harder to get that information, but if you wanted to, you could find it. And so in that sense, kind of having that information all online doesn't kind of radically transform government, but having people able to communicate, enabling kind of individuals to have an effective voice in government is something that's just fundamentally new. And so in the old days, I could write a letter to my member of Congress, or I could pick up the phone, and when I was a kid, you actually had to dial a rotary phone to call, right? And it was you were just one person with one voice. But now, if I wanted to, I could go online and communicate to the office in a variety of different ways, but also communicate with my fellow constituents and try to kind of coordinate some action in a way that I wasn't able to when individuals really didn't have so much of a voice. And so back in the old days, it was sort of the gatekeepers like political parties and elites within a town that kind of were the ones that really had a voice in politics. But now, because of new technology and our ability to really, as individuals, to speak publicly, that's really new, and it's really transforming how government functions, I think. Yeah.
And so, as you mentioned, kind of like the digital aspect of this day and age, and how it's adding this voice, or at least a voice that can be heard by many, to individuals within society. What are some of the biggest advantages or disadvantages that comes with that? Like you mentioned, the aspect that it can hold governments more accountable, or it can make them more transparent. But is there has there been aspects of digital democracy that have kind of leaned the other way?
Well, the advantage is that we don't, as individuals, need to rely so much on intermediaries to express our concern to the government. So again, it used to be, if I had a concern, if I wanted that my voice to be effective, I'd have to work through a political party or through an interest group or some local elites, right, in order to have my concern kind of expressed effectively to government. And that's changing, because I think politicians are kind of attentive to social media, and I think it does really empower individuals to have a more effective voice. But it has a downside in that it when you have kind of lots of people, lots of individuals with sort of all expressing their own individual views at scale, members' offices can get really overwhelmed with all of the messaging they get. And so there's people who track sort of the rise of constituent correspondence, and the slope looks like that, where offices now are really just overwhelmed with communications from their constituents, and a lot of it is like we're picturing kind of individuals writing their concerns, but a lot of it is generated kind of inorganically by interest groups kind of getting people to kind of write lots of form letters, and it makes it hard for the office to kind of sort through and figure out what do my constituents really think, when they're really just overwhelmed with correspondence. With a lot of it is kind of not the grassroots correspondence from their constituents, but it's more correspondence that's been engineered by an interest group. So that makes it harder for offices to really use that input, that this kind of new kind of input could be really valuable for offices, but it's because it's done at scale, and when you have everybody that's trying to communicate all at the same time, it's hard for offices to kind of figure out exactly what they should be thinking or listening to based on all of that noise. Yeah.
So would you say on that point, in a lot of ways, like interest groups or any organization or individual that falls under the umbrella of interest groups are kind of still acting and conducting themselves in a similar way to how they did in the past? They're just doing it through a different medium, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that technological aspect.
So interest groups always did that. They always engineered letter writing campaigns to offices, particularly membership groups that had kind of lots of members. But if you look at kind of the data, the input that offices are getting, it's just kind of that letter writing campaign, but on steroids, and it really overwhelms the capacity of congressional offices, and at really all levels of government. So it's hard for them to make sense of it. Yeah.
And I guess in a lot of ways, that kind of transitions slightly into the point, because I've seen, and I'm sure we've all seen, that happen on like social media. Twitter is a big one, where you'll see these interest groups or even sometimes individuals with a huge following kind of direct their followers or the people that subscribe to them to actually go and, as you said, write these letters to an elected official or whatnot. And so would you say that social media in that aspect specifically has played like a negative role in terms of being able to communicate with your elected officials?
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing about social media is the same problem occurs, that I'm describing, of kind of that kind of the problem of communication at scale, when you have kind of lots of people who are all talking at once. that also causes problems for the social media platforms, and I think originally people thought of social media as kind of a positive thing for democracy because, in the early days, when the platforms were relatively small and just getting started, people thought it would be kind of this new way of everybody being able to kind of express their views and express their individuality. People, mostly the people who were kind of the early pioneers of social media applications, thought of it as a positive thing. And I think the reason is that they knew themselves and their friends and people like them, and everybody, would be interested in kind of contributing in a constructive way to kind of conversations on social media. But what's happened over time is, as the platforms have grown, the volume of communication is just too immense for that social media companies really have to kind of curate the content that gets circulated on their platforms, just because there's just too much of it circulating. And then at the same time, kind of bad actors have go on to social media and kind of exploit its vulnerabilities to pursue agendas that are sometimes undemocratic. So I think, yeah. And then as I think because of this problem of scale, that social media companies have to make use of algorithms in order to curate the content that users get to see. It's just because it's not possible. If you think about, like, if you're on Facebook or Twitter and you have hundreds or thousands of friends and they're all posting things, it's just a cascade of information that you'd never be able to make sense of. And so social media companies have to kind of curate that content for you in order to make it useful for you, in order for you to find using the platform useful. But then the way they write the algorithms is in a way to kind of curate the content so that people get information that they like to see, that makes them kind of happy and want to return to the platform. And a lot of times the way they do that is they provide content to users that is kind of consistent with their own predispositions of what they kind of believed to begin with, because that's something that we find attractive. And so the more that they kind of give you information that confirms whatever predispositions you have, the more it kind of reinforces those, and it leads to kind of extremism on the platform. So that's kind of a downside, I think, to the problem of scale.
So with that kind of mentioning of like a confirmation bias almost, of receiving information that you want to hear, and it's almost more believable. How has social media kind of contributed to the growth of those echo chambers, or the growth of that problem? And if so, what is kind of what warning should be heeded about the development of these echo chambers on digital platforms?
Well, the social media companies are for-profit companies, and so they want you to keep returning to their platform. And what they found is the most effective way to do that is to give you information that you find attractive. And generally the information that we find attractive is information that we already strongly agree with. And so as a result, the social media companies will, as they're sending you information that you find attractive, you end up not seeing so much information that might disagree with your predispositions. And so that puts us all, when we're online, we end up in an echo chamber where we just kind of hear views that reinforce whatever views that we had. They become even stronger and more reinforced. And so that makes people more extreme. But if that's happening to everybody, then everybody's kind of becoming more extreme, but in the direction of their predisposition. And so that leads to having a society that's increasingly polarized as a result. And so that in itself is difficult, because then if we don't hear kind of the views and reasons for people who disagree with us, right, and only hear views and reasons from people who agree with us, not only does that reinforce our predispositions, but it makes us think that the people who disagree with us have no reason, there's no merit to support their position, that they're just dumb or misguided. And as a result, we're finding it's harder and harder for us to be able to speak across our differences. And we see that a lot in politics these days, that people just have really lost the ability to disagree. And then the other thing that echo chambers do is it creates, makes users vulnerable to misinformation. So when misinformation ends up circulating inside of your echo chamber, typically it's misinformation that kind of, again, confirms your predispositions. And so there isn't really an incentive for people to fact check it or to debunk it. And so misinformation tends to circulate kind of in a more persistent way inside of echo chambers. And that kind of undermines our ability as in our democracy to really have kind of a good factual basis for politics and for being able to talk about politics. Yeah.
I think it's not only upsetting, but it's also so tricky because these are, all of these companies that we're talking about are privately owned, mm-hmm. and they're for profit, and their goal is just to make as much money as possible. Yeah. Yet, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these different companies are having a profound effect on our democracy as a country, but also on how, like you mentioned, how people even interact has changed so much. So much so that if you disagree with someone else, you're less likely to actually even give them a chance, let alone potentially come to a compromise or at least try to maybe have your opinions challenged. So this next question is probably really difficult, but what can we do when these companies are privately owned? Is there any avenue? Because, based on everything you're saying and a lot of the talk that's been going on the past few years, it's very clear that there has been a massive effect on the way we conduct ourselves in terms of our political processes. Yeah,
so to some extent, there's a little bit of self-correction that's happening on social media now, because if the social media platforms just become a cesspool of kind of misinformation and ideological content, at some point people are going to find it less useful, right? And they know that, and so they're actually trying in some ways to kind of tweak their algorithms to make it less, to sort of reduce the extremity and to suppress misinformation to some extent. And then they're also aware that not regulating misinformation and extremism can lead to other kinds of problems, like the January 6th insurrection that was in response to a lot of information that was election misinformation that was circulating on Facebook and Twitter at the time. Right, so I think social media companies are becoming more aware that there's kind of real life consequences that they could be held accountable for in different ways, and so they're trying, I think, to clean it up a bit. And you actually saw it in the recent this recent episode where Elon Musk is trying to buy Twitter and to turn it into kind of a Wild West of free speech, and what people are noting is that he's either just trolling them to get attention, but if he's not, people think it's a bit strange, because if he were to do that to Twitter and remove all the protections of sort of suppressing misinformation and deplatforming extremists, if he were to kind of remove those safeguards, it would make Twitter a less profitable company, because it would become a cesspool and lots of people would leave it. And so you see that with the Twitter board is actually taking strong steps to prevent him from doing that. So at least they're trying, they're not fully, sort of revamping their systems to kind of be good at reinforcing good democracy, but at least they're doing some things to prevent some of the harms that they've been doing. Yeah.
And I guess a follow-up to that would be, I think that the point that you made about Elon Musk is super interesting, and it is really fascinating to see someone, the richest man alive, actually get involved in these kinds of things. And it really just goes to show how much of an impact that wealth and power can have.
Yeah.
on our democratic systems and the way we conduct democracy in the country. But I think another interesting point is also, do people actually want, how many people actually want that kind of landscape? So for example, like how many people actually want Twitter to be a Wild West where you can say whatever you want, versus because there's also strong supporters for and against the idea of like censorship on social media. Like what are the actual numbers on what people want in that sense, and then also are those people actually right in wanting that outcome, if that makes any sense?
So that I don't know. I know that there's organizations like Pew do a lot of survey of American attitudes about social media, but I just haven't seen kind of the latest about that. But I do think people are concerned about things like, election misinformation leading to violence, and vaccine misinformation, right, causing people to die unnecessarily. And I think they're aware of that. And I think you also see it that the platforms that really are, designed for just unfettered discourse really aren't succeeding, like Gab and Parler, Getter, right? Are these is that right? Am I saying that? Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of Parler.
And they're just not being. They're not. They're not. They're really not taking off because I think in the end it's not really what people want. Yeah, that there's sort of that there ought to be even for individuals to have some accountability when they have speech, right? That they right, and if you have no accountability at all, then that creates kind of an undemocratic setting. So yeah.
I also feel like one thing on that point, and I think it's interesting that you brought up Parler, which is the older one that I was unaware of, is you'll see like small subsections try to do that kind of Wild West, as you said, a type of setting where it's just anything goes and there's no censorship. But also another thing that you keep bringing up is this idea of like accountability, and we've been talking about it, accountability on the sense of like Twitter doing something to actually, or Facebook doing something to prevent something like January 6th, which was obviously a tragedy. And so, but in terms of accountability on the individual, on these services, like there really isn't anything that we can do, because you either these companies either input policies that have censorship, or they try to prevent certain kinds of rhetoric, or they don't, and then you get people saying spreading misinformation about the vaccine or anything like that. And so it seems like there's really no solid middle ground. You either kind of have to pick one or the other.
So for people who study misinformation on social media, that it's actually just a tiny fraction of people who account for most of it. So like something like 1% of the 1% account for like 80% of misinformation that's circulated. So most people, I think, but I think that then once it's circulated, it ends up kind of reverberating and circulating across the platform. So it ends up having it kind of travels widely and has an effect. But I don't think that, I don't know if, so I don't know. I'd have to, sort of how you, I do think that there are probably incentives for people when on social media, if they want to kind of attract attention or attract likes, attract retweets, to be kind of more extreme in a way that they might not be in a if they were actually talking to people in an interpersonal context. So I don't know. Yeah.
And I guess one thing that this also brings up, kind of taking a step back and looking at it from a larger perspective, is do you think that social media or any of this digital communication has kind of shifted, the way we look at democracy in general? Like the idea of democracy, has it shifted, or is it just, again, the medium has changed, the ideas and ideologies are still the same?
Yeah. So I think social media is it's accelerating but it's not necessarily the root cause of polarization. And so I think now, people are worried about democracy and democracy's ability to function and to solve problems to solve our collective problems, right? Democracy seems to be kind of dysfunctional because of polarization and our inability to kind of talk across differences. And so I think a lot of people are kind of souring on democracy, and even you see this internationally, that people are becoming more interested in kind of authoritarian approaches to government in a way that 5 years ago I wouldn't have pictured as even being possible, right? So I do think that kind of polarization and the amount of misinformation and the amount of extremism is kind of undermining democracy and undermining our confidence in democracy. But I think that was happening even in the absence of social media, that we kind of do it in our day-to-day lives and in the neighborhoods we choose to move to and the places we choose to work and our friends that we interact with, even offline, that we tend to create these echo chambers for ourselves anyway. And I think that's all getting easier to do now than it used to be. So people are more mobile, right? And they just have kind of more sort of options for sorting themselves into echo chambers, both online and offline, in a way that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, it was just harder for people to do that, to be able to kind of isolate themselves and not really have contact with people that don't agree with them. So I think social media is kind of fueling that, and it's fueling that people's mistrust in democracy and their lack of faith in democracy. But it's not necessarily the cause of it. Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, because you'll see a lot of people kind of point to social media and kind of blame it for a lot of the problems. And like you said, it's not to say that there aren't issues caused by it, like the echo chambers we talked about, or some of the other issues we've spoken about, but that there are larger larger factors that need to be considered, that are more interpersonal and that aren't connected directly to social media, because you'll see it so much. I mean, I see it all the time where people.
It's a time of a lot of change, and when there's lots of change in lots of different ways in our society, we go through these periods of kind of disruption and anxiety, and social media doesn't help it. But I think that it's just something that we as a society have to kind of work through and kind of learn how to live in new circumstances that are matched to where things are headed. And I think once we do, then this will all sort out. But we're just kind of going through a transition phase right now. Yeah.
Can you, I guess, based on that point, were there any other, just for context, what other points in the last maybe 50, 20 years, or maybe even further back, would you say were, points where there was some kind of disruption in society that caused people to have to shift their mindset? Is there anything you can think of that would?
Well, yeah. I mean, the last kind of big disruption was the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That's kind of really is what has set things in motion to the politics that we have today, and it's kind of unfolded over a long time. But in the 1960s, there was kind of this alliance between non-Southern Democrats and Republicans were kind of in favor of advancing civil rights and inclusion, and Southern Democrats were opposed to it. You all know this, right? But then because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and other things set in motion in that time, the Democratic Party became kind of more progressive on civil rights and inclusion, and that set off a realignment where Southern Democrats ended up realigning, dating back to an initiative that was started in the Nixon administration to help to kind of lead Southern Democrats to realign to become Republicans. And so the today's Republican Party is essentially the heir to the Southern Democrats' kind of resistance to inclusion, and that's what we're seeing. And that was kind of a process that unfolded, starting a little bit before the Nixon administration got started, up through now. Yeah, it's been unfolding over time, and so and I think that's kind of where we are, and it's time to. And that I think that as a society we're kind of grappling with, well, like, that's where we are, and we have to figure out how we're going to go forward from here. Yeah.
It's just fascinating that, like, the way we communicate with one another can have such a massive impact on some of
well, I mean, they talk about this for the civil rights movement, the photographs from Selma, from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the beatings that happened there were really impactful on, and ended up having a lot, sort of changed how Northern Democrats thought about civil rights, and really kind of set the stage and motivation for passage of the Voting Rights Act. So, like, technology has always played a role. It's just been something different, that those were black and white photos in newspapers, and now we have YouTube videos and TikToks and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So I guess since we're kind of heading towards the end of the episode, I do want to kind of end on some of the work you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
In this context.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
Just for our audience, can you first describe what Repanium is? And then also what your personal goals are in regards to Repanium, but maybe even beyond some of the other work you're doing?
Oh, that's a lot. So
that is a lot.
So why don't I just try to say what Repanium is,
sure.
and then if you want, I could follow up on it with anything
Definitely.
else. So I had a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation like a decade ago, where we had a chance to work with members of Congress on using web-based, essentially webinar platforms to think of making more effective use of webinar platforms to enable members of Congress to have more effective town halls and kind of a more robust conversation with their constituents on policy topics. And that was trying to get at this problem that we started with, where congressional offices are getting kind of a lot of mail, but they don't really know how to sort through it. And so we wanted to help them think of ways to use technology to connect directly with their constituents and hear directly from their constituents, but also to have constituents feel empowered, right, that they have a chance to speak directly to their member of Congress. And so we came up with some best practices, and then we did a study where we kind of implemented those in collaboration with members of Congress, having town halls with their constituents, and ended up having kind of a set of best practices that came out of that. And when that study ended, I felt like the next step in that research, there were different directions that I could go in, but what I thought was the most important next step was to think about finding ways to encode those best practices into the technology itself. And if you think about, if you've ever been on a town hall with an elected official that's hosted on like a Zoom webinar or a Facebook Live or something, right, as a participant, you have very limited opportunities to kind of express your views. And so webinars really are just mostly an opportunity for public officials to just communicate their message to their constituents, but it really isn't a chance for them to kind of hear from their constituents and learn from them. And so we designed a new platform it's like a webinar platform, but it has much more extensive tools for participants to be able to express themselves during the meeting. So there's they have a chance to ask questions, see the questions that other constituents are asking, to like other constituents' questions, to quote them, to expand on them, but also to give kind of continuous feedback in real time to the moderator, the person who's hosting the event, with their thoughts about sort of what the speaker was saying. And so we really wanted to give participants really much more robust opportunities to express themselves and be heard. And then at the same time, we wanted to create tools for the person that was hosting the town hall to curate the question list as it was coming in, to figure out kind of how to curate it effectively to know kind of what question to ask next. And so if you think about if you're on a town hall where there's 1,000 other people all asking questions at the same time, right? You need some way to kind of sort through the question list to figure out, well, what's the best next question to ask? And so we've created tools for the people, the organizers, the people who are kind of hosting the event, to be able to sort through the question list really effectively, which, like on a Zoom webinar, you just get this flat list of questions. You don't know how to what to go to next. And then the other thing we're trying to do is to do the computer science research to design algorithms that do kind of the opposite of the algorithms that we see on social media companies. So algorithms that would help the host, the moderator, the person running the event, to see to be able to sort the questions in a way to see the full diverse set of views from the community, as opposed to sort of whatever the loudest voices or most persistent voices, but to try to kind of find ways to balance it out so that everybody's voice could get heard, and also to build in tools that check as people are asking questions, that it tests for whether those questions really are on topic or off topic. And so, questions that are disruptively off topic would be given less priority, and ones that are on topic would be given more priority. And just things like that, just things to sort of help the moderator to curate the question list, to make it an effective meeting, even when the meeting grows to having a lot of people and a lot of participants. So we're working on that now, and we have a pretty stable version of the platform, and then the algorithms is sort of our next phase. We're trying to do the research to do those.
That's super cool, and I think it's really important work.
Oh, thanks.
That I haven't really heard of people actually talking about this kind of developing this kind of platform that makes it more efficient. Usually it's just something that's specific to something about social media, but not on the actual democratic aspect of it. And I guess kind of going off of that, do you have any personal goals in regards to Repanium, or maybe other goals you have going on?
Well, what I'd like is for Repanium to become to develop to where it can be kind of part of the normal workflow of democracies. And so one thing, I've worked with members of Congress in the past, and I still work with members of Congress, and I have opportunities to give input to Congress to make recommendations, and so I hope that they make more extensive use of it. But I also have a group where we're trying to think of how to apply the technology to local level meetings, which is really different. And a lot of times local meetings are a bit harder to manage because people oftentimes have stronger views on if it's about housing or homelessness or crime. That the topics that come up at the local level tend to evoke really strong responses. And so it's like an interesting but tough test case, to think about how to apply the technology at the local level. But what we would like is eventually for either Repanium itself or a platform like Repanium to become scaled up to where it becomes more of a routine part of the workflow of democracy, and give people a more effective voice at different levels of government. Right, but then designing the technology in a way that helps to ensure that as they're expressing themselves, they're doing it in a way that's kind of on topic and constructive. So that's what we're hoping to do.
I think that's a great note to end on. We talked a lot about the negatives and the way our society and our democracy has been impacted. But it's great to see that there's another aspect to it, that this technology can be used for positive purposes. And I think it's a great note.
Exactly. Technology is neither good nor bad, right? It's just how it's designed and how it ends up getting used. So
I think that's a great quote to end on. How we use technology is more important than dictating whether it's good or bad. And it's not black or white. There are gray areas, and it's about the people that work on it, and what we want to do is can help determine the outcomes of all of this. So That being said, we are at the end of our allotted time, Professor Esterling. Thank you so much for joining us for the first in-person podcast recording.
Great, yeah.
It was an honor to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.